Lecture number 2, we're going to talk about the barriers to entry by microorganisms and other things that are foreign to your body. And we actually talked about these before back in chapter 11. We were talking about the skin and the mucous membranes and how those can be portals of entry if microbes have a way to get through those barriers. So some of this is actually going to be review. And this certainly is. We've already talked about the skin and its properties that make it a barrier to entry by microbes. Plus you talk about this when you take Biology 201. So you guys, as we've discussed before, here's a generic skin chunk picture over here. And your skin is divided up into two major layers. So you have this upper layer right here called the epidermis and this thicker layer beneath it called the dermis. And all along the surface of the epidermis you have lots and lots of microbes, and many of those microbes, or most of those microbes, are supposed to be there. They're protecting you from nasty ones that could start growing there and causing an infection. And as you guys have learned, the surface of the epidermis, the skin cells there are dead, and they're really just filled up with a leftover skeleton, more or less, of keratin proteins. And then there are some other molecules called glycolipids, which are sugar lipid combinations that form kind of a filler glue between those dead cells in the epidermis. But those things help make the epidermis waterproof so that water doesn't evaporate out of your body and water can't penetrate the skin. But it also makes the epidermis a very, very tight barrier. Most microbes can't penetrate through the epidermis to get down here into the dermis where they're not supposed to be. So just keep that in mind. With the skin, the surface of the epidermis has microbes on it, but you go even a little bit deeper from there, and as far as we know, we don't have any normal microbes that always live down in the dermis. Some other properties of the skin that make it a good barrier. The pH of the skin is actually a little bit lower than what you find elsewhere in the body. Those outermost dead cells of the epidermis that are covered with microbes, they're constantly flaking off. Here's what they look like under an electron with an electron microscope. And so that helps control the numbers of microbes that are present on the surface of the skin and helps prevent them from overgrowing to astronomical numbers if they're constantly flaking off with your dead skin cells. And then when you guys are taking Biology 201, you do learn a little bit about how you have these spidery looking cells that live up here in the epidermis, and they're capable of doing phagocytosis. They're called dendritic cells or Langerhans cells, and yes, it is the same Langerhans as islets of Langerhans in your pancreas, where the cells are located that make your insulin and your glucagon hormones. So the reason they're called dendritic cells, hopefully dendritic is reminding you of something from when you studied the nervous system, your dendrites. And dendrites are those spidery looking appendages that extend outward from the main body of your neurons. And so when people first discovered these cells living in the epidermis, they thought they looked like neurons because of all those spidery appendages. Those look like dendrites to them, and they're actually not. What they're there for is to capture microbes. They have all these long appendages sticking out, and so if microbes are trying to invade through the epidermis, it's very likely that they're going to get captured by these dendritic cells. So these dendritic cells do phagocytosis, and we're going to talk more about them later, even when we get to the second half of the immune system, the third line, because they play an important role on activating the third lines of your immune system defenses. Your dermis does have some properties that help make it a barrier to microbes entering. Hopefully you got over here on this skin chunk diagram where you see all the light pink color. Hopefully you guys remember that consists of dense irregular connective tissues, which is full of collagen fibers. And collagen fibers have tensile strength so that when you pull on your skin, you can't just rip off a skin chunk really easily. And that property of your skin and other tissues of your body, that ability to resist tearing, is largely created by collagen fibers that fill up a lot of the spaces in those connective tissues. You also have elastic fibers in there as well. That's why when you pull your skin, it can snap back into place. Of course, it gets less elastic as you get older and older and older. The dermis also has lots of blood vessels in it. The epidermis does not, but anytime you're looking at a diagram of the dermis, you'll see lots of blood vessels present there. And blood vessels bring in the major weaponry and components of your immune system, including the white blood cells that play such important roles in our immunity. So if you do have an injury or an infection in the skin, those blood vessels are going to allow the major weapons of your immune system to get out of the blood and into those tissues to help fight infections. Okay, in addition to all those great properties the skin has, there are also some chemical substances that are always present in your skin, and they help control microbes. They have antimicrobial properties, and some of these are antimicrobial peptides. So they're chains of amino acids. They're proteins. And what these do is most of them are pore formers, like you see over here. And we've talked about that before. We talked in chapter 11, we talked about how some nasty types of pathogenic bacteria produce exotoxins that will insert themselves into the membranes of our cells and cause those cells to burst. And they do that by creating pores. And we also make weaponry like that. And some of those are called dermacidins, others are called defensins. And what they do is these are proteins that can attach to the cell membranes these are mainly active against bacteria. They'll attach to the membranes of bacteria, and they assemble pores, and then that causes those cells to die. Some of them are also active against fungi as well. Some of these are mainly found in the skin. They're released in perspiration from your sweat glands, and those are called dermacidins. Then others are called defensins, and so they're produced by more cell types. Neutrophils are a type of white blood cell. NK cells are one of the cell weapons of your immune system that we'll talk a little bit about as well. And then various epithelial cells around the body, which you find in places like the skin and your mucous membrane linings, can make these as well. So dermacidins and defensins are pore-forming proteins that can attach to many types of bacteria, some types of fungi, and if they do, they're probably going to kill those microbes. Sounds great. So you may wonder, well, hell, why don't these kill all of the microbes we get exposed to? And it just doesn't work that way. As we talked about back in chapter 11, the pathogens have developed many strategies to get around things like these antimicrobial peptides, and that allows them to persist in our tissues long enough to grow and reproduce and cause disease. Also in your skin, there are enzymes called lysozyme enzymes. These are not the same as the lysosomes we've talked about that your phagocytic cells have, that are basically little membrane-covered compartments of digestive enzymes. This is different. This is a very specific enzyme. And what it does, it breaks the bonds between the sugars. Remember those NAG-NAM sugars you have in the peptidoglycan cell walls of bacteria? This enzyme breaks apart those NAG-NAM sugar strips that you have in bacterial cell walls. And by doing that, the cell wall protects bacteria from bursting due to osmosis. So if you degrade the cell wall, they're going to be much more likely to burst because of that. Lysozyme enzymes are actually secreted in our perspiration, and also in your saliva. They're present in your tears as well, so that the skin is not the only place where you would find lysozyme. Again, sounds wonderful, but it doesn't kill every type of bacteria that we get exposed to. None of these things are 100% efficient. So we still need other much more powerful branches of our immune system as well to help us out. Sebum is skin oil produced by your sebaceous glands, gets released onto the surface of your skin, and unlike your body fluids, which have a pH normally between 7.35 and 7.45, sebum has a slightly acidic pH. So the pH conditions of the skin are a little bit on the acidic side, and obviously lots of microbes don't mind that, but many of them do. It helps keep the numbers of microbes on the surface of the skin under control, so you don't have a huge overgrowth of microbes in that location. Okay, so that's the skin. The mucous membranes are the other super important barriers to entry of microbes into the body. And again, keep in mind where you have mucous membranes, they line the interior compartments of your respiratory tract, digestive tract, urinary, and reproductive. And and we back in chapter 11, we took a look at this example mucous membrane lining. This is what it would actually look like under a microscope. And this is supposed to be right in here. That's the space inside the trachea. And down in here, these are deeper tissues within the wall of the trachea, but this represents the inside lining of the trachea. And this is a cartoon drawing of that mucous membrane lining inside the trachea. And it consists of a type of tissue called pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which you may have learned about in Biology 201, and jam-packed epithelial cells that are columnar in shape. And it's called pseudostratified because it almost looks like you have multiple layers of cells, but it's really just one, and they're all twisted around each other to create that appearance. The ciliated part refers to these cilia that you have along the surface. And down in the trachea, those cilia sweep mucus that has trapped dust and microbes upward and out of and away from the lower respiratory tract. Sweeps them up to the back of your throat so that you either cough them out or you swallow them and they go sliding down into your stomach acid and they get zapped by the low pH down there inside the stomach. You don't have cilia along all of your mucous membranes. You really have that in your lower respiratory tract and up in your nasal cavity as well. It's performing much the same type of job there. Most of your mucous membranes, though, do have mucus, the sticky fluid, on the surface, and that plays a very similar role across most of your mucous membranes in helping to trap things that are foreign and keep them from invading deeper parts of the body. But just like with your skin, your mucous membranes, if you wind up with microbes up here along a mucous membrane, because those epithelial cells are so jam-packed tightly together, most microbes can't get through there. Now, as we talked about in chapter 11, some microbes make enzymes, things like hyaluronidase, for example, that help them break apart the connections between those epithelial cells, and then they can get down in here into deeper tissues where they have access to things like your bloodstream, and that can carry them to other parts of the body. But the vast majority of microbes that we get exposed to, the ones that you breathe down into your trachea all the time, can't do that. So they just wind up getting caught in the mucus and coughed back out of your lower respiratory tract. The cilia down there are often referred to as the ciliary escalator, the ones that you have along your lining of your trachea, because they sweep upward. They sweep things that are foreign upward and away from the lower respiratory tract. Mucous membranes have chemicals, antimicrobial chemicals, just like your skin does. Saliva actually has a slightly acidic pH that lots of microbes don't like. Now, obviously, you've got plenty of microbes living in your mouth. I don't care how often you brush your teeth. There are tons of them in there. But if you didn't have this slightly acidic pH associated with your saliva, the population would just be much higher than it already is. Lysozyme, that's the enzyme that degrades bacterial cell walls. And urea and uric acid are wastes that are produced by the cells in your body and that you have to excrete. You excrete most of those in your urine, but some of those waste molecules get into your saliva as well, and they're actually toxic for a lot of microbes. The stomach, low pH, actually 1.2 to 3, which is very low. Most microbes can't handle that. So when you swallow things down into your stomach, they're going to get zapped by those, by that low pH. The acids there are going to destroy them. Now just keep in mind when you get down here into the intestinal tract, this is not your stomach. The intestinal tract has very different jobs from your stomach, and the environment there tends to be much closer to your normal body pH. So the acidic conditions are in the stomach, not in the intestinal tract. But when you do get into the intestinal tract, you have those digestive enzymes and things like the bile salts we talked about earlier in the semester that help you emulsify fats. Those are not too friendly to most microbes that actually make it through the stomach and down into the intestinal tract. Along the vaginal lining, the pH tends to be lower, acidic, and that's mostly due to bacteria that live there naturally that are called Lactobacillus acidophilus. And acidophilus actually means acid lover. And what those bacteria do is they do fermentation with carbohydrates that are present in the mucus along the vaginal lining, and they create acids from that, from doing fermentation, and that helps lower the pH along the vaginal lining. So that controls overgrowth along the vaginal lining by other types of microorganisms that might get in there and try to overpopulate. When you take Biology 202 and you learn about the reproductive system, you learn about how semen contains alkaline compounds that help reverse that acidity along the vaginal lining so that sperm cells can actually survive in there long enough to make it up into the uterus and the fallopian tubes to find an egg to fertilize. The urinary tract, we've talked about this before. Urine has an acidic pH. It's about pH 6. It contains urea and uric acid wastes, other kinds of metabolic wastes produced by your cells that are not particularly friendly to microorganisms. So that's generally not a great environment for microbes. Plus you've got the urine stream all the time flushing microbes out. Microbes that cause UTIs, that may occur when the acidity along the urinary tract changes, or they have ways of attaching along that lining. Maybe they have fimbriae, those little spikes that will help them attach to those tissues and survive those conditions. Some types of microbes that cause urinary tract infections, they don't care about urea. They make enzymes that break urea down, so they have strategies to get around that otherwise toxic compound that's present in our urine. All right, another special barrier feature at the eyes, which we talked a little bit about this back during chapter 11 as well. Your tear-producing glands are up here, superior and lateral to your eyes, back in your orbital cavities, your eye sockets. And those are called your lacrimal glands, and they produce tears that constantly flush across the surface of your eyes, and then those drain into the nasolacrimal duct over here and flow down into your nasal cavity. So that's happening all the time. That's what keeps your eyes moist. But one of the main purposes of those tears is to flush microbes that land on your eyes off of the surface. So again, the flow of your tears is from these lacrimal glands up here, superior lateral portions of your orbital cavities, across the surface of the eye, then those tears draining down through the nasolacrimal duct. And then they're either going to run out of your nose, or you're going to swallow those tears back into the back of your throat, where you will either cough them out or swallow those microbes that got drained off of the surface of your eyes down into your stomach acid to kill them. So when you talk about all this stuff, it's a wonder that anything actually ever gets into the body. We have lots of really useful things here that are just part of our barriers. Tears also contain lysozyme. That's the enzyme that breaks down bacterial cell walls. All right, and just one more time, we've talked about this many times this semester, but your normal microbiota help your first lines of defense. You have normal microbes on your skin all over the place, and in some, along some of your mucous membrane linings. And one of the main ways they do that is through microbial antagonism. If they're there, they're taking up space, they're competing for nutrients, moisture, things like that. And by doing that, they're hopefully preventing pathogenic microbes from overgrowing in that environment. They also do that, as we just talked about. There are some cases where your normal microbes help lower the pH in certain locations like the skin and along the vaginal lining. In addition to our own antimicrobial proteins that we've talked about, some normal microbes make antibacterial proteins that poke holes in the membranes of other microorganisms. And that's thought to play a role in microbial antagonism as well, improving your health. We've talked before about how some of your normal microbes down in the colon produce vitamins for us. That helps improve our health because we can't make vitamins on our own. We either get them from our diet or we rely on these normal microbes to make some of them for us, but we got to have them. They're cofactors for enzymes that our cells have to use. And these antimicrobial substances that I was talking about that some of our normal microbes make, many of those are called bacteriocins, and those are hole-punching proteins. Those are pore-forming proteins. They attach to the membranes of other microbes and poke holes in them. Some microbes too, some of our normal microbes are thought to help stimulate the production of our own antimicrobial peptides that poke holes in the membranes of other microorganisms. So that's kind of a recurring theme that we hear about over and over again. Some pathogens have ways of poking holes in the membranes of our cells, and we do the same thing back to them. And then even some of our own normal microbiota produce proteins called bacteriocins that poke holes into the membranes of other types of microbes. Interesting, there are people, so we talked about the defensins, dermacidins, as examples of hole-punching proteins that our cells make. Our normal microbiota, some of them make bacteriocins as hole-punching proteins. So there is some interest in, well, okay, so now that we know this, these are fairly new discoveries, probably in the past 10, 15, 20 years. So there's a lot of interest now in whether or not we can harness these types of things. Can we use biotechnology to make these hole-punching proteins artificially and use them maybe as new types of antibiotic drugs? As we've talked about, we've got a big need for new types of antibiotic drugs that we can give to patients to help fight bacterial infections. So maybe these are some things that we could harness artificially to accomplish those types of things. All right, for the third lecture, we're going to start talking about the second lines of defense. And this is mainly going to get into a number of our white blood cells and the special jobs that they have in helping us fight infections.